Hello and welcome again to Give and Take. I am Jeff Zwerink, and this is the segment of the show where we discuss challenging scientific issues to equip you to be confident in the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by Ken Samples and AJ Roberts, and we're going to discuss whether the fall of Adam and Eve caused all the disease and death that we see in the earth. AJ, Ken, good to have you here again today.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff. So, I mean, you look at things like Ebola and HIV and these other things, and you think, how could a good God create these sorts of things? AJ, how would you respond to that charge or that question?
Well, I would say that viruses, the way that we've understood them, at least historically, is because they've caused disease, whether in people or in animals or in plants. And so we look at the things like Ebola and flu and we think, oh my goodness, why are people getting sick? And we've known for 150 years or so that it's viruses probably, or bacteria, right? But what we didn't know, and that we've only come to know recently, is that viruses are everywhere. There are more viruses than there are stars in the universe, at least estimations of both.
That's quite remarkable, because there are a whole lot of stars in the universe. So we're talking like 100 billion trillion stars in the known universe.
Yeah, I think it's 1 by 24 zeros if it's your stars.
Right.
If it's my viruses, it's 1 in 31 zeros.
All right, so you got more zeros than I do.
We got more zeros.
Okay, so you got more. So if there's that many viruses around, why aren't we sick all the time?
Because the vast majority of them don't cause diseases of any kind, right? The vast majority of them actually infect bacteria. And that is actually at the very foundational level of our ecosystem. It's what keeps bacteria in check, so the rest of us higher living organisms have a place to live, and the world's not just a giant ball of bacteria.
So is it more that, so is the idea there that the viruses are limiting the bacterial population so they don't cause more disease, or is it that they're limiting the bacterial population so that other bigger things can be around?
Well, it's the second point that I was trying to make.
Okay, all right.
So, viruses are incredibly diverse, and every virus has one thing in common, and it's that it can't reproduce on its own. It needs a living cell to reproduce. Well, bacteria are living cells that are masters of adaptation. And so if the world had the amount of bacteria that it has without viruses to control the bacterial population, bacteria would basically be sequestering all of the resources and filling the planet to the point where other life forms were excluded from being able to survive.
So in some sense that kind of shifts the question then, and I'll ask the question a little differently. If viruses are needed to control the bacteria population, why do we need bacteria and viruses in the first place?
Because it's the foundation of our food chain, right? So bacteria are primary producers. They help turn things like chemical and light into sugars, into food sources that the rest of living animals on Earth and plants and all kinds of organisms can use to grow and reproduce. Okay,
so you've got to have the bacteria around because that's what takes kind of the raw materials and makes the base of the food chain for everybody else.
That's right.
You need the viruses to kind of keep them in check. But at the end of the day, some of these also cause diseases.
Very few of them cause diseases, yeah.
Yeah, but they cause some pretty vicious ones.
They do cause some pretty nasty.
What's going on there?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that I have the complete answer to that. Other scientists sometimes think of the origins of viruses, which we don't really know or understand. And they'll think of it as sort of as like defunct cellular machinery. But, I certainly think the vast majority of viruses were part of God's creation. Yet there might be some subset that we encounter in ways that we shouldn't encounter through the mismanagement of the environment. But there are other viruses like Ebola. To imagine Ebola might have a positive role in nature, that would take some sort of wild speculation. But we don't know. I mean, maybe it does in some organism.
So Ken, let's throw this over to you. What does the Bible have to say about this? I mean, there seems to be some positive aspect to bacteria and viruses, but there also seems to be some negative aspects. So biblically, how do we think and deal with this?
Well, I think if you look at it from the context of human life, death, the fall, the key passage in the New Testament is in the book of Romans. But the death that's described there that comes to human beings from the fall is human death. It's not all death. And so if God created a world, and if bacteria and viruses are a critical part of that created order, I don't think bacteria and viruses came from the fall directly, but it's the death of human beings which in some cases might involve viruses and bacteria.
So you've got the death of humans flowing from the fall where we rebelled against God, but if bacteria and viruses were there, at some level you've got death or these diseases and things just incorporated into the creation that God made. So how do we wrestle with that? That seems problematic.
Well, if God created the world and He has a place for this remarkable vegetative life as well as animal life, and if bacteria and viruses are part of the food chain, maybe there's a trade-off in all of this. I mean, one of the things that RTB that we talk about in terms of what, as a philosopher, I would call natural evil, is that it's not all evil. There is the other side of it. So maybe in this specific case, maybe it's like hurricanes or tornadoes where they can be very brutal, they can be very destructive, but they bring things to the environment in which we live that are critical. Earthquakes, another example. Maybe it's something like that.
So how would you respond to the person who goes, if there's a God, why didn't He just create everything idyllic here? Why do we even have to have some of this good and bad? Is God just incapable of doing anything better?
Well, I think there are things God can't do. He can't create a square circle, so even God can't do the irrational. But maybe God creates a world that goes through a process. I mean, this is not the greatest conceivable world, but it's the road to the greatest conceivable road. And it is the world in which we develop character. And I can tell you, as a person who had a bacterial infection, it was very, very difficult, but it also, I think, grew my character. And so I think God knows what He's doing, and the things that we see are for His intended purposes. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with human character.
When it comes to the character aspect, I like to think of it in two different ways, right? You just talked about when you had a bacterial infection and it grew your character, but when I see somebody else suffering, it also gives me an opportunity to engage with them in ways that are
Empathy,
compassion, maybe self-sacrificing.
Yeah.
And that's building my character as well.
Yeah.
So it's not just what's it doing for me and maybe the soul formation or the character development that God has in mind for me, but for us.
That's right.
Yeah.
That to me seems a rather remarkable thing, that we are not in the final creation. God has a much greater creation that this is the preparation for. And so we do see these things where they seem kind of like trade-offs. There's good and there's bad. And when we look at viruses and mosquitoes and other things, we see, well, maybe they're bad, but there's also got some good. And we see that God is preparing us for that ultimate creation, but in the process, giving us tools so that we can grow and develop in character and reflect His character to those around and spread the hope that only He brings.